Welcome back to our exploration of Middle-earth's deepest mysteries. Today, we're diving into one of the most enduring conflicts in Tolkien's world, the ancient animosity between elves and dwarves. This wasn't just a simple dislike or cultural misunderstanding. It was a hatred so profound that it shaped the very fabric of Middle-earth's history, influencing everything from the fall of kingdoms to the outcome of the War of the Ring. But why did these two noble races, both children of Ilúvatar, come to despise each other so deeply? The answer lies buried in the mists of the Elder Days, in tales of betrayal, greed, and tragic misunderstandings that echo through the ages. Today, we'll uncover the truth behind this legendary feud. To understand why elves and dwarves came to hate each other, we must first understand their fundamental differences. These weren't merely cultural distinctions. They were differences written into the very essence of their beings. The elves, known as the Quendi, or the Firstborn, were the first children of Ilúvatar to awaken in Middle-earth. They emerged at Cuiviénen under the stars, immortal and bound to the world until its ending. The elves were creatures of light and beauty, blessed with wisdom, artistic skill, and an innate connection to the natural world. They were tall, graceful, and possessed an otherworldly quality that set them apart from all other beings. The dwarves, or Khazad as they called themselves, had a very different origin. They were not among the original designs of Ilúvatar, but were created by Aule the Smith, one of the Valar. Aule, impatient for the coming of the children of Ilúvatar, fashioned the seven fathers of the dwarves in secret. When Ilúvatar discovered this act, he did not destroy Aule's creation, but instead gave them true life and souls, though he decreed they must sleep until after the awakening of the elves. This difference in origin created the first seeds of tension. The elves saw themselves as the rightful firstborn, while the dwarves, though created by a Vala, were seen as somehow lesser or secondary. The dwarves, proud and stubborn by nature, resented this perceived slight and maintained their own fierce independence. The physical and cultural differences between the races were stark. Where elves were tall and ethereal, dwarves were short and stocky, built for endurance and strength. Where elves lived in harmony with nature, creating their cities in trees and caves that complemented the natural world, dwarves carved great halls deep within mountains, reshaping the earth to their will. Where elves valued beauty and artistry for its own sake, dwarves prized craftsmanship and the creation of objects of lasting value. These differences might have remained mere cultural variations, but they were magnified by the fundamental nature of each race. Elves were immortal, with all the time in the world to perfect their crafts and contemplate beauty. Dwarves, while long-lived, were mortal, creating an urgency in their work and a desire to leave lasting monuments to their skill. Most importantly, both races were proud. Elven pride was subtle, refined, born of their immortality and their status as firstborn. Dwarven pride was fiercer, more immediate, born of their incredible skill and their need to prove their worth in a world that often looked down upon them. The seeds of hatred between elves and dwarves were watered by blood in the Elder Days, specifically through the tragic events surrounding the Silmarils. These three jewels, created by Feanor, the greatest of elven craftsmen, contained the light of the two trees of Valinor and were the most beautiful objects ever created in Middle-earth. The story of how the Silmarils came to involve the dwarves is complex and tragic. After the destruction of the two trees and the theft of the Silmarils by Morgoth, the jewels became objects of obsession and desire for many in Middle-earth. One of these Silmarils eventually came into the possession of Thingol, the Grey King of Doriath, through the love story of Beren and Luthien. Thingol, possessing this most precious of jewels, decided to have it set into a necklace called the Nauglamír, which had been made by the dwarves of Belegost in ancient days. He commissioned the dwarves of Nógrod to set the Silmaril into this ancient work, and here the tragedy began to unfold. The dwarves who came to Thingol's court were master craftsmen from Nógrod, skilled beyond measure in their art. When they beheld the Silmaril and understood what they were being asked to do, to set this jewel of incomparable beauty into the ancient necklace crafted by their kinsmen of Belegost, they were overcome with desire. The Silmaril's beauty was such that it could drive even the most noble beings to madness and greed. As the dwarves of Nógrod worked on setting the Silmaril into the ancient necklace, their desire for the jewel grew. They began to believe that they, working with the craftsmanship of their Belegost kinsmen, had as much right to the jewel as Thingol did. When the work was completed and Thingol came to claim his property, the dwarves refused to give it up. They claimed the necklace as their own, arguing that their labor had earned them the right to keep it. What followed was a confrontation that would echo through the ages. Thingol, proud and imperious, was outraged by what he saw as the dwarves' betrayal and theft. Words escalated into violence, and in the ensuing struggle, Thingol was slain by the dwarves. The king of the most powerful elven realm in Middle-earth was dead, killed by those he had trusted to serve him. The murder of Thingol sent shockwaves through the elven world. The dwarves fled with the Nauglamír, but their escape was short-lived. The elves of Doriath, led by Thingol's surviving captains, pursued them and fell upon them in the woods. Most of the dwarves were slain, though a few escaped to carry news of the disaster back to Nógrod. When the dwarves of Nógrod heard of the fate of their kinsmen, they were filled with rage. They gathered a great army and marched on Doriath, seeking vengeance for their slain brothers. The elves, still reeling from the loss of their king, were unprepared for such an assault. The dwarves' attack was devastating, and they succeeded in sacking the great city of Menegroth, slaying many elves and carrying off great treasure. But the dwarves' victory was short-lived. As they returned to their mountain home, laden with spoils, they were ambushed by the elves of Osiriand, led by Baron himself. The dwarf army was utterly destroyed, and the Nauglamír was recovered, though at a terrible cost in blood on both sides. The events at Doriath left scars that would never fully heal. From the elven perspective, the dwarves had committed the ultimate betrayal. They had been welcomed as guests and craftsmen, trusted with the most precious of tasks, and had repaid this trust with murder and theft. The image of greedy, treacherous dwarves, willing to kill for gold and jewels, became fixed in elven minds. The dwarves saw things very differently. To them, Thingol had been arrogant and dismissive, treating them as mere servants, rather than the skilled craftsmen they were. When they had claimed their rightful payment for their work, he had responded with violence and death. The subsequent massacre of their kinsmen and the ambush of their army only confirmed their belief that elves were treacherous and cruel, hiding their malice behind fair faces and noble words. These opposing narratives were passed down through the generations, growing more distorted and more bitter with each telling. Elven children learned that dwarves were greedy and untrustworthy, while dwarf children learned that elves were proud and murderous. The original complex circumstances of the tragedy were simplified into racial stereotypes and mutual hatred. The hatred was further reinforced by the fundamental differences in how the two races viewed the world. Elves, with their immortal perspective, saw the dwarves' actions as a moment of madness that had destroyed millennia of peace. Dwarves, with their mortal urgency, saw the elves' reaction as proof of their inherent cruelty and sense of superiority. The geographical separation of the races also contributed to the perpetuation of hatred. Elves lived in their secluded realms, while dwarves dwelt in their mountain halls. Contact between the races became rare and was often limited to trading relationships that were formal and distant, without regular interaction to humanize the other race. The stereotypes and prejudices only grew stronger. By the Third Age, the hatred between elves and dwarves had become so ingrained that it was simply accepted as natural law. The events of the Elder Days had passed into legend, but their effects lived on in the hearts and minds of both peoples. This animosity is perfectly illustrated in the relationship between Legolas and Gimli during the War of the Ring. When they first met in Rivendell, their mutual distrust was immediate and instinctive. Legolas saw in Gimli all the negative stereotypes of his people, a crude, greedy creature obsessed with gold and jewels. Gimli saw in Legolas the arrogance and condescension that dwarves had come to expect from elves. Their initial interactions were marked by barely concealed hostility. Gimli's reaction to Galadriel's gift of hair was telling. He was amazed, not just by the gift itself, but by the fact that an elf had shown him such honor. It spoke to how unusual kindness between the races had become. The transformation of their relationship from hatred to friendship was one of the most significant healing moments in Middle-earth's history. It showed that the ancient wounds could be healed, that the barriers between the races were not insurmountable. Their friendship became a symbol of hope and reconciliation. However, their personal reconciliation was exceptional rather than typical. The broader populations of both races remained largely separated by mutual suspicion and dislike. The elves of Rivendell and Lothlorien maintained their aloof distance from the world, while the dwarves of Erebor and the Iron Hills continued their insular existence. Before we dive deeper into the psychological roots of this conflict, if you're enjoying this exploration of Middle-earth's hidden histories, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more content like this, and we have so many more Tolkien mysteries to uncover together. Central to the conflict between elves and dwarves was the issue of pride. Both races possessed it in abundance, but it manifested differently in each. Elven pride was ancient and refined, born of their immortality and their status as the firstborn. They had witnessed the rise and fall of ages, had walked in the light of the two trees, and possessed wisdom and knowledge that no mortal race could match. This pride was often subtle, expressed through a sense of inherent superiority that they might not even consciously recognize. Dwarven pride was more immediate and fierce. They took immense pride in their craftsmanship, their courage, and their ability to create lasting beauty from raw stone and metal. They were proud of their independence and their ability to thrive in environments that other races found inhospitable. However, this pride was often defensive, a response to what they perceived as the condescension of other races. When these two forms of pride clashed, the results were explosive. Elves would unconsciously adopt attitudes of superiority, while dwarves would respond with defiance and aggression. Each race interpreted the other's behavior through the lens of their own cultural assumptions, leading to misunderstandings that quickly escalated into conflict. The language barriers between the races also contributed to their problems. Elves spoke in flowing, poetic languages that emphasized beauty and metaphor. Dwarves spoke in harsh, consonant-heavy tongues that were direct and practical. When members of each race attempted to communicate, the very sound of the other's language could seem alien and unpleasant. Cultural misunderstandings abounded. Elves valued subtlety and indirection, while dwarves prized straightforward honesty. An elf's attempt to be polite might be seen as condescending by a dwarf, while a dwarf's direct manner might be interpreted as rudeness by an elf. Beyond the immediate causes of conflict lay deeper philosophical differences that made reconciliation difficult. These differences touched on fundamental questions about the nature of existence, the purpose of life, and the relationship between the individual and the world. Elves, as immortal beings, had a fundamentally different relationship with time and change. They could afford to take the long view, to wait centuries for problems to resolve themselves, to pursue perfection at a leisurely pace. This gave them a sense of detachment from the immediate concerns of mortal races, and could make them seem aloof or uncaring. Dwarves, while long-lived, were mortal and felt the urgency of time. They worked to create lasting monuments to their skill, knowing that they would eventually pass from the world. This urgency gave their culture an intensity and focus that could seem obsessive to immortal eyes. The two races also had different relationships with the natural world. Elves saw themselves as guardians and shepherds of nature, working to preserve and enhance the beauty of the world. They created art that harmonized with natural forms and lived in ways that minimized their impact on the environment. Dwarves saw themselves as shapers and molders of the natural world. They carved great halls from living rock, redirected underground rivers, and transformed raw materials into objects of lasting beauty. To them, the highest calling was to improve upon nature through skill and craftsmanship. These different approaches to existence created fundamental incompatibilities. What elves saw as harmony with nature, dwarves might see as passive acceptance of imperfection. What dwarves saw as improvement and progress, elves might see as destructive interference with natural beauty. The hatred between elves and dwarves was also fueled by economic factors that are often overlooked in discussions of their conflict. Both races were skilled craftsmen, but they operated in very different economic systems that created natural tensions. Elves, with their immortality and connection to the natural world, had little need for the accumulation of wealth in the traditional sense. They created beautiful objects for their own sake, not for trade or profit. Their economy was based more on gift-giving and reciprocal obligations than on monetary exchange. Dwarves, on the other hand, were skilled miners and metalworkers who created objects of great value. Their economy was based on the extraction of precious materials from the earth and their transformation into valuable goods. They were natural traders and merchants, dealing in currencies and exchange rates that had little meaning to elves. When the two races did engage in trade, these different economic philosophies created friction. Elves might offer a beautifully crafted item as a gift, expecting nothing in return but goodwill. Dwarves might interpret this as condescension or an attempt to create an unfair obligation. Conversely, when dwarves demanded fair payment for their work, elves might see this as crass materialism. The stereotype of dwarves as greedy and gold-obsessed partially stemmed from these economic differences. Elves, who had little need for material wealth, couldn't understand the dwarves' focus on precious metals and gems. They interpreted this focus as moral failing rather than cultural difference. The hatred between elves and dwarves was also manipulated and encouraged by external forces, particularly the dark powers who sought to divide the free peoples of Middle-earth. Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, understood that divided enemies were easier to defeat than united ones. He actively worked to sow discord between the races, using agents and spies to spread rumors and exacerbate existing tensions. The corruption of the Silmarils and the madness they induced in those who possessed them was part of his broader strategy of turning the forces of good against each other. Sauron, Morgoth's successor, continued this policy of division. He understood that, as long as elves and dwarves remained enemies, they would be less likely to unite against him. The isolation of the Elven realms and the insularity of the Dwarven kingdoms suited his purposes perfectly. The influence of these dark powers was subtle but pervasive. They didn't create the hatred between elves and dwarves from nothing, but they certainly encouraged and amplified existing tensions. Every misunderstanding, every slight, every moment of conflict served their broader purpose of keeping the free peoples divided. The cost of the hatred between elves and dwarves was enormous, both for the races themselves and for Middle-earth as a whole. This animosity prevented cooperation that might have changed the course of history and led to countless missed opportunities for mutual enrichment. Consider what might have been achieved if the wisdom of the elves had been combined with the craftsmanship of the dwarves. The elves possessed ancient knowledge and magical abilities that could have enhanced dwarven work, while the dwarves had practical skills and techniques that could have aided elven projects. Together, they might have created wonders that surpassed even the Silmarils. The isolation of both races also made them more vulnerable to attack. The elves retreated to their hidden realms, while the dwarves shut themselves up in their mountain halls. This isolation made them stronger defensively, but weaker strategically, as they couldn't call upon each other for aid in times of crisis. The hatred also had psychological costs for both races. The constant suspicion and hostility created a climate of fear and mistrust that stunted cultural development. Young elves and dwarves grew up learning to hate before they learned to understand, limiting their potential for growth and wisdom. Perhaps most tragically, the hatred between elves and dwarves served the purposes of their enemies. Every moment spent in mutual antagonism was a moment not spent in resistance to the growing darkness. Every opportunity for cooperation that was missed was a victory for the forces of evil. Despite the depth of their hatred, there were moments throughout Middle-earth's history when elves and dwarves managed to overcome their animosity and work together. These moments, though rare, showed that reconciliation was possible and highlighted what could be achieved when the two races cooperated. The most famous example is the friendship between Legolas and Gimli, which began during the War of the Ring. Their initial hostility gradually gave way to mutual respect, and eventually to deep friendship. Their bond became so strong that Gimli became the only dwarf ever to sail to the Undying Lands, accompanying Legolas on his final journey. Earlier examples include the cooperation between Elrond and the dwarves of Durin's folk during various crises. Despite their mutual suspicion, they were able to work together when faced with common threats. The presence of dwarves at the Council of Elrond showed that cooperation was possible when the stakes were high enough. There were also smaller moments of understanding and cooperation that are often overlooked. Individual elves and dwarves who worked together on trading expeditions or shared quests sometimes formed bonds that transcended racial prejudice. These personal connections, while not enough to heal the broader rift, showed that the hatred was not insurmountable. The key to these successful reconciliations was usually the presence of a common threat or goal that forced the two races to look beyond their prejudices. When faced with orcs, dragons, or other enemies, elves and dwarves could recognize their shared interests and work together effectively. The hatred between elves and dwarves in Middle-earth serves as a powerful reminder of how ancient grievances can poison relationships for generations. What began as a specific conflict over the Silmarils and the Nauglamír became a general racial animosity that harmed both peoples and served the interests of their enemies. The story shows us how pride, misunderstanding, and cultural differences can escalate into lasting hatred. It demonstrates how stereotypes and prejudices can be passed down through generations, growing stronger and more distorted with each telling. It reveals how external forces can manipulate these tensions for their own purposes. But the story also offers hope. The friendship between Legolas and Gimli proves that even the deepest hatreds can be overcome through personal connection and mutual respect. Their journey from enemies to friends shows that reconciliation is possible when individuals are willing to look beyond their prejudices and see the person rather than the stereotype. The hatred between elves and dwarves was not inevitable or natural. It was the result of specific historical events, cultural misunderstandings, and the manipulation of external forces. Understanding this gives us hope that such conflicts can be resolved and that the wounds of the past can be healed. In the end, the greatest tragedy of the elves and dwarves was not their hatred itself, but what that hatred prevented them from achieving together. Their story reminds us that our differences can be our greatest strengths if we choose cooperation over conflict, understanding over prejudice, and friendship over fear. The lesson of Middle-earth's ancient hatred is ultimately a lesson about the power of choice. We can choose to perpetuate old grievances, or we can choose to build new bridges. We can choose to see enemies in those who are different from us, or we can choose to see potential friends. The choice, as always, is ours. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of Middle-earth's most complex conflicts. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It's a simple click and means a lot to the channel. Your support helps us continue exploring the depths of Tolkien's world and bringing you these deep dives into the lore we all love.